Hey everyone, we're happy you could join us for today's session, Mobile Test Automation 101, with guest speaker Justin Ison. Justin is a senior success engineer at Applitools, and previously he was a senior software engineer at Microsoft Germany working on the Wunderlist app. He has over 17 years of experience working on software quality, with the last 6 primarily developing server, web, and mobile test automation. So without any further ado, Justin, the stage is yours.
Great, thanks, Addie. Hi, everyone. As Eddie mentioned, my name is Justin Ison, and today I'm going to talk to you about everything you need to know about Applitools visual testing with Appium. So let's get started. So the challenge: how are we going to test all of these? As you can see, there's so many different devices out on the market today. There's lots of different manufacturers, different OS versions, different sizes of phones, and how could you possibly test all of these? And in today's agile world, we're becoming shorter sprints, quicker to market. You're having less time to even develop your app, but even more less time to test your app. And how will you test each one of these test cases? Validate every single locale language your app supports. So a lot of apps today support, multiple languages. So you need to validate all these different locale languages and in your app to make sure that they are correct every time you make a change. Same goes with every OS version that your app supports. It needs to be validated. And different resolutions and screen sizes, such as phones, tablets, phablets, iPads, iPhone 7 Pluses now are quite large. And all the different manufacturers like Samsung, Google, Apple, HTC. There's so many different manufacturers, and each do uniquely different things to their specific device and operating system running on that device. So you could try to do the single-threaded approach manually, though you probably kill yourself like this guy did. So it's definitely not recommended. Or you could try the manual multi-threaded approach. Also not recommended. As you can see, this drove this guy insane. Alternatively, you could hire an army of zombie testers if you could find them, but it's definitely not recommended. So device orientation, also very important for your application. So if you're testing a mobile web app or even a native app, you want to make sure that your device looks correct in all the different orientations. From my experience, most people only test their application in portrait orientation, which makes sense. I mean, it's what fits comfortably in your hand. It's the way that most people use their phones, but people tend to forget to test their app in landscape. The designer, the UI, the developer may not have counted for landscape. So when you rotate your orientation, how's your app going to look in that orientation? How's your designs going to look? How's the functionality? A lot of times I've seen some apps that are just unusable when you rotate them to landscape. And here's an example of actually what happened to me with an app where, in this case, the screen just went blank. It couldn't handle when I rotated it to landscape. Whereas you would never know this. These are things you need to test, but if you don't rotate your application, or whether it's either a mobile web or a native app, how would you ever know that your app can handle this? So same goes for device resolutions. Most people only tend to test the device resolutions that are available to them. You only may have a couple of devices that are available, internal locally, but how are you going to know that your device and your designs handle all these different resolutions? Hopefully this doesn't occur. This is designer built this design for a specific resolution, and then on a smaller resolution screen, it got squished, which is not what you would want. But you would never know this unless you tested against these different resolutions. Hopefully also not like this. Same thing goes for OS versions. As you can see, there's a ton of different OS versions now. There's 14 for Android and iOS, where iOS 11, I believe, is being released today. So you can see there's quite a lot of different OS versions, and of course you need to account for those when you're testing your application. And a lot of people at the same time only test with the device OSs that are available to them. So how are you going to test to make sure your app works on iOS 7 when you only have a device that's running iOS 10 or 9? And you also want to make sure your app, functions and the designs and everything works in all these different OS versions. Same goes for device language. A lot of people, majority of people only test with their native tongue, which makes sense. Most people know one language, and they're not going to test all the different languages their app supports. But you need to, and this is where automation comes into play, to be able to test all these different languages. And how are your designs and languages going to work for languages such as Arabic and Hebrew? Whereas if your application was designed and built by a designer and engineer that from a Western language, they need to account their designs to handle languages such as Arabic and Hebrew that are, from right to left versus left to right for Western languages. The same thing goes for the indentation. Everything starts from the right to left for Arabic and Hebrew, where you need to make sure your designs can handle that. And for languages with longer strings such as Deutsch, your design and your functionality of your application may have only accounted for, Western languages, whereas like in English, a word may be only 10 letters long, but in Deutsch it could be 15 letters long. So you need to validate that and make sure that it actually works. So what options do we have? Test automation with Appium and Applitools, of course. So what I'll demo, just showing you a quick start guide of getting started with Appium and Applitools for both mobile, web, and native apps. Integrating Applitools into your test framework and showing the benefit it provides. Running your tests locally, and then scaling your tests on a cloud service. So here's just a high-level overview of what you need to do to get started with Appium. For iOS, you need to install Xcode, install the command line tools, and then you need to create a simulator or connect a real device. And then for Android, you have to have the Android SDK. You need to create an emulator, and this is recommended. So when you create an emulator, you need to make sure you install the Intel Haxum accelerator. Otherwise, the emulator would be extremely slow and unable to use it. Or you could just connect a real device and enable debugging mode. And you got to install the Appium desktop, which is essentially the Appium server. Make sure you have at least JDK 8 Java. And later on, I will give you more links to the install instructions for Appium and other helpful links as well. So Applitools' bread and butter is testing responsive design. So you have a mobile web app, and you want to make sure that it functions and looks correctly on every single release, on every single responsive design you account for. So as you can see here, here's iPhone 5, iPhone 7, and iPad, each displaying differently. iPhone 5 only has a sliver of what iPhone 7 shows, and the iPad functionality of the web view completely changes. Here you have a login area, whereas you don't have that in the others. And At Applitools, we have many different SDKs and libraries to get you started. As you can see, we have Selenium for all the different languages that are supported. We support Water, Capybara, coded UI, and then with Appium, of course, all the different languages. So let's go ahead and choose Java. So it's very simple. All you have to do is, in your POM file of Java, is just import our iSelenium Java 3 library, then build your Maven file. And here's a very simple example of a mobile web example. Here once you create an account, you get an API key. We're going to initialize our eyes object. We're going to go ahead and set force full page screenshot to true. Our stitch mode will be CSS, so as our page scrolls down to capture the entire page, we will capture it with that. And our match level is layout, and I'll get into more details later about what that is. And we're going to set a batch, which is essentially a batch info, which is essentially a folder. We're going to just call it GitHub. And for those of you that have done mobile web before, it's just very simple, similar to even Selenium. It's just you're setting your capabilities. We're going to give it an Android, and then we want it to open the Chrome browser. And then very simple, our task is just navigate into GitHub, and then it's going to capture a full page screenshot. We need to then start the Appium desktop, where we start there with the server. And we'll go ahead and run it. So you can see here on this particular device, it went to github.com. It's now finding out the screen dimensions, and it's going to capture the entire page. Why is that important? And what I found, through my career is like a lot of people tend to forget the way down bottom of the page. There's a lot of times there's functionality down there that needs to be validated, but a lot of times it's skipped by either manually testing or even writing automation, where you tend to focus on the top where all the menu bar is to navigate to different areas of the page. Whereas there could be functionality at the bottom of the page that is completely broken, where you never see because you never scroll down the page. But with Applitools, taking a full page screenshot, you capture that information. So anytime you make a change to your application and this runs, you run your tests, whether you're running them manually on here or you're running them through CI, it will then capture the page and then validate that it is correct. And we're done. So you can see here at the end, we give you a link to see the results on the dashboard, and we'll go ahead and do that next. So I just need to exit out. So you can see here on my screen, we have our GitHub. This is the screenshot that we just ran. You can see here it was for Android 7, and that was the resolution 360 by 512. You can see here we have the entire page of what it looks like at this resolution. And here's what I was saying before, whereas you have an application, but if you don't scroll down and validate it, again, whether you're doing this manually or even with automation, how are you going to know that this functionality down here is working, or if any of these links are correct, whether they're formatted correctly and that they're displaying, you would never know unless you're validating a full entire page. So that's why it's very important to capture an entire page, and that's where the power of visual testing comes into play. So we'll go back to... Same goes for a native app example. A lot of people build their native apps, but you need to validate that they work. And every time you make a change, you want to make sure it visually works. And the good thing about visual test automation, whether it's mobile web application or even a native application, you may only have a few assertions to assert certain functionality works correctly on the page, but visual test automation captures everything. So if you're just asserting like one or two things on a particular view, a screenshot with automated visual testing is going to assert 1,000 different things. So anything that's on the image itself is asserted every time you test it against a baseline. So you can see here with this example, it's very similar to what we did for our mobile application, mobile web application, except now we're just passing in an app name and giving it a value to the APK file. And we're just clicking a couple of links to get to the view we want to test, and then we go ahead and take our screenshot with our check window, and then eyes closed closes the session and uploads the image. And we'll go ahead and run that example real quick. And we're done. Then again, you can see we were giving our link to our baseline, or to a test that we just ran, and that will go and show us our comparison against our baseline. And we'll go again, once again, take a look at the dashboard, see what that looks like. And you can see here, it took a screenshot. We have the screenshot of the page that we wanted. What we can do here is, so you can see and we can go back to the other example I'll show you. Obviously, there's dynamic content on almost everything that you test. A nice thing of tools that we provide here is we could go ahead and ignore that region, because obviously the time's going to change. I mean, we could also move this back to here to only ignore the time. So any tests in the future, whether it's 10 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock, it won't care. It will ignore that region and validate everything else. And this is what I was saying with the visual assertion, is it is validating everything. It's validating this is there, that this title is there, these images are there and in their correct place, whereas you may only assert that you're on this page and that image is there, or that this says image collection, whereas single screenshot Applitools eyes validation checks that. And going back to the design again, for a web page like GitHub, where it's dynamic and it's constantly changing, we have capabilities to validate that the layout is correct and not going to fail on any time somebody makes a content change. And then we'll go back to plain. So that's great and all, but how do we scale this? So obviously there's several options. One, you can run all this on your local computer with multiple devices and emulators connected and run there. That's one way of doing it. You have to have a pretty beefy machine in order to do this, but it's definitely doable, or multiple machines for that matter. You could have an internal Selenium device grid. That's another alternative. And there's several different cloud test services, Sauce Labs, BrowserStack, Bitbar, Perfecto Mobile, Firebase, Amazon Test Cloud, and they all, they all have their pros and cons, and they all offer unique features. Some are very good with reporting, give you great analytics back, and some are just very bare bones. But let's go ahead and let's run with Sauce Labs. So by far the easiest solution would be to use a cloud service running in parallel. You can run it in single-threaded, but again, much like my image earlier with the guy, sitting on the stump, it would take forever, and you're not gaining much if you're just running single-threaded. So running things in parallel is the key. And so what are the benefits of Test Cloud Service? They are the present and the future of automation testing. I could see in the future that we probably will never run any tests locally, or hardly ever. Everything will be running on the cloud. You have the ease of setup and integration. You don't have to buy all the different mobile devices and set up the machine. It's all done for you. And it provide you with excellent analytics and reporting. Some actually integrate really easily with CI test services or cloud services, such as Travis CI. So you could actually have all your tests, all your tests, code, everything on the cloud, and nothing's local. And you get to expose your app to a much larger range of devices and operating systems. And that's the key. Whereas if you, again, going back to what I was saying before, if you only have so many devices and OSs and resolutions locally, you can get all that on a cloud test service. So first, what we want to do is just create a simple parallel class. This will take all our OS and browser combinations and split them into their own threads. Here's an example for Sauce Labs. The key thing, this is essentially the same as what we showed earlier locally, but we're just going to show that we have our lists here at the top, our linked lists, and we're just going to test against these different emulators and devices that are available on Sauce Labs. And obviously you want to test against different platforms, different OS versions, and then different resolutions. And from there, it's almost, like I said, the same as before, where we split it out into their own thread, and then we connect to Sauce Labs, we go to github.com, and then again we take a full page screenshot of each one of those platforms. So again, let's go look at the results. So you can see here we have our Safari 9.2 ran. And we have our full page screenshot in Safari. And all our different devices, iOS 9.3, and then Android 6.0. So this is the power of using parallel testing with Sauce Labs or any cloud provider, whereas you can create a dictionary with all your different device and OS versions and split those off into different threads and then test them. Whereas this would be very difficult and costly to do if you did this locally. Oh, and we have one more I forgot to show you, and then same goes for our native app on Sauce Labs. How are you going to test all these different resolutions and different locales for native applications? Here is one device at this resolution, 800 by 1216. It shows a certain amount on the view, and then here's another resolution. You can tell it's completely different, where it doesn't have a space as where this one does. Same, this one has a smaller space because it's a different resolution. And so obviously your functionality and your designs change as your resolutions change, and this is why this needs to be validated, because you never know this if you didn't test it on all these different OS resolution combinations. And let's go. And what about Locale? So again, we want to validate different localizations, languages, and this is the power of what Applitools brings using our layout match level algorithm. So let's go ahead again and look at an example for that. As you can see here, we have our devices in English, but our baseline's in Spanish, and it actually passes. You can see the words are completely different, but we pass it because it is validating with our layout algorithm, which is validating that the layout of the page is correct. Where this menu option is there, this title is there, these icons appear, and then the layout, general layout of the page is still there. This email buttons is still there. But if we go ahead and switched it to strict layout or match comparison, it's going to fail because this strict level comparison is human eyes level. And you can see now as I change, it's failing because of the words going back and forth. And then same thing with this one. We've got Spanish as our baseline and English in the words, but if we switch it again to strict, it's going to fail for all the different matches. Again, up here for the time, but we could go ahead and ignore that region. Then anytime in the future, it will ignore that. So you can see now it's passed and doesn't care about the time difference anymore. And again, same thing for different languages, and we pass it. So that's the power of what Applitools visual testing can bring to your application. Testing on multiple different OSs and OS and devices, and validating that your application can work correctly of both all the different locales. So again, like I was saying before, if it was in Deutsch and the word was the string of the word took the view or shifted the view, you would catch that because the layout algorithm would say that the layout doesn't look correctly in this language, and you would know whenever you run your tests. And so here's some helpful links to get you started. Again, these slides will be pushed out later. They will give you later for your reference. There's also going to be a recorded video of it. Here are the Java examples that I just showed you. There's links to that, get you started for using Java and Applitools. And there's just getting started with Applitools in general tutorials. And we have a Java SDK guide that will give you detailed information of each method that's available with that SDK. And then we have this for every single binding that we have. So if it's C#, Ruby, Python, we have it, just to name a few. And we have a plethora of video tutorials available out there. We have a YouTube channel that has a ton of different videos of different techniques on how to do mobile visual test automation, both on web, mobile, you name it. Oops, sorry. And with that, thank you. Is there any questions?
Yeah, we actually have a lot of questions. As I said before, we might not get to all of them, but the ones that we are not going to answer live, Justin, you and your team will take via email afterwards. So actually, the first question, I really like that. In the Sauce Labs example that you gave, could we please see one of the failures?
Yes. This was a failure because it was new. So on what we do with our SDK, anything that's either new or an actual failure, it gets marked as a failure, and that's why that occurs. But what we can do for other failures is I have another example I could show you that would work better. And let me just go to my other Applitools dashboard. Actually, I could just do it here. This one is in particular to mobile applications, but it would be the same if it was a mobile app. With our dashboard, we have our radar feature, which we could highlight all the discrepancies that are caught during testing. We could drill down to our first one. In this case, it caught a spelling mistake. You can see here it should have been more, but it got switched to an A. So that's great that it caught that. Otherwise, very easy to not catch if you're manually testing that. And even automation, would you assert that value of that button? Probably not. Maybe you would. Here's just a layout issue where the developer may have changed the CSS incorrectly and shifted this logo over, but it was caught during visual testing. And we have a lot of tools to handle cases like that. We could create, instead of using, you could either do an ignore region or we could actually create a floating region. And the power of the floating region is for cases such as this, or if you say you have an icon that, can be anywhere on the screen on your view, and depending on when you go to that screen or not, it could be in a completely different place. You could create a floating region around that and say, as long as it's within this floating region, we'll go ahead and pass it. So it's more power of what we provide for visual test automation. So hopefully that answered your question.
Next one. Can I give you the next one?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Okay. Why did you use remote web driver and not Android driver or Appium driver?
Well, I guess there's different, there's obviously different drivers. The remote web driver is what is used to talk to the Appium server. I suspect those other drivers actually use the remote web driver because in order to do mobile automation in general with Appium, you have to use the remote web driver. So again, hopefully that answered your question. If not, please ask again or follow up, or I can email you more with details.
Okay, we got an interesting question. Okay, is Applitools only being used for validation/assertions, or can it be also used for operational items, for example, click, select, etc., through visual comparison, for example, with Sikuli? So I think that maybe, Justin, if you could give a word about the difference between Applitools and Sikuli, and then answer the question, that would be awesome.
Sure, yeah. So the difference between Sikuli and Applitools is Sikuli is a visual-driven test automation, I guess. So it uses the UI to visually identify areas to go and click at, whereas Applitools doesn't do that. Applitools imports and rides on top of your automation framework, whether it's Selenium or Appium or any of the others, and then captures a screenshot of a baseline image, and then anytime in the future compares the baseline and your current test automation image of your test run and compares those. Whereas Sikuli is just purely based on driving your automation visually. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
I'm scrolling down. Is Applitools only being used for validation/assertions, or can it be also used for operational items such as click, select, etc.?
Yeah, I mean it's actually it can be used for both assertions and visual functionality. So like say you, for example, you have a script and you click a button to create an action. By clicking that button, you've now changed the state of your UI, and of course then you could take a capture an image, whether you're capturing an image or a region within the page. And that's something I didn't show you in this, but you're not limited to just capturing the entire page or just the visual page that you can see. You could actually capture regions. So if you had like a checkbox or a text input field or just a login form and you just wanted that login form or an image, you can actually use the SDK to capture it with like your Selenium or Appium finding elements. You could grab the locator and create get the element and then upload that image of that specific element itself.
Okay, next question. How do you feel about testing on real devices rather than emulators or simulators?
Good question. My personal opinion is I think emulators and simulators are fine for, for your CI process. Like, so if you just wanted quick, fast results on every single build you're doing, I think those emulators, simulators are fine to use. But you do want to test against real devices, so you might want to have a separate subset of tests or like a regression test that runs in CI. Maybe this runs nightly, maybe it runs once a week or twice a week. Then that you would test on real devices. But I think using simulators and emulators are fine when you're doing CI of testing on every single check-in.
Okay, the next question, we got quite a few about this topic. It's about setting the baseline. So I'm just going to pick the one that is the most comprehensive one. How do I set in Applitools what previous image to compare with?
So it's always your last image that you save, and I'll go back to the dashboard. So it's always your last image. So like this isn't my current image now. So once I give it a thumbs up, it's now my baseline. Now what's this guy? Because I'm logged into my other account. But I'd give it a thumbs up or I'd reject it. If I reject it, my previous image that I had before that wasn't my baseline would still be my baseline. But now if I created, I did a new test run and I said, okay, well, lots of changes have occurred on my site. Let's go ahead and give this a thumbs up and I'll save it. That will now be my baseline. So it's always your very first run creates your baselines, and then every run after that compares against your baselines, unless you go ahead and thumbs up and save it, and then that going forward will be your baseline.
Great. Just before we continue, I just wanted to mention I'm getting a lot of questions about the recording. So I just want to say again, we are recording this session, and I will send you Justin's slide deck plus a link to the recording on Friday. So look out for that in your inbox. It will arrive. Okay, no worries about that. And I'll get you the next question. Yes, another one about the baseline. Where and how are the baseline images stored?
They are stored locally. I mean, okay, it depends. We have different service levels. So if you're using our public cloud, which would be private to you, of course, they would be stored internally in Applitools cloud storage. But we have, well, for different tiers, we also offer on-prem installations, whereas you would host your own services on your own rack or dedicated in AWS, and you'd have your own storage, and then your images would be kept, for however long you want to keep them, so they're there forever, or you could delete them whenever you want. You can maintain them that way. Or we also do a dedicated cloud instance where we still host it, but it's dedicated through your firewall, so nobody can get to that service. And then again, your images are on there as long as you need them for.
Okay, next question. How is Applitools different from Robot framework?
Well, so robot framework is just another framework built on top of Selenium. Um, it's different as whereas we aren't a framework per se, we are an SDK that you import into your framework, where we ride on top of whatever you build. So if you want to run Applitools inside robot, you would just initialize, you'd import our library and then take your driver object that you get that obviously executes any of your Selenium of activity functions, and you would set that to our Applitools driver.
Okay, so we are running a bit late, but I think we will take one or two more questions. Is there any limitation in terms of programming language for Appium, C#, JavaScript, etc.?
I mean, I wouldn't say really limitations. I mean, some languages do have, obviously more users than others. So by that, per se, obviously you get a lot more documentation and examples out there. Like Java, I think, is the most popular language for Appium, so there's tons of content out there. C#, I think is just fine for Appium. There may not be as much content as what Java has, and then same thing for like Ruby. Ruby may not be the most popular language out there, but there is some information out there for it as well. So it all depends.
Okay. Are there any recommendations for how to group and name tests so it's easy to see if there are failures across a particular browser or locale?
Browser, yeah, there is. I mean, we offer a customized properties that you could set. It's a method within our SDK that you could set to tag different locales. So then you could actually then sort within the dashboard by that locale, or I mean, it's not locale. These are all customizable. So, but you could do one for locale. So you can set a locale for German, and then you could sort and filter within the dashboard all your test runs that were with German, and then you can see by there whether you have more failures with German versus French or Spanish. So that's one way of doing it. We do have on our roadmap a reporting feature coming out that will give you more analytics on like which tests are failing, more and which aren't, and that is on the roadmap. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be released, but hopefully within the next quarter.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank everyone that took the time and joined us for this live session, and of course, I want to thank Justin for this really in-depth Appium masterclass. And I hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you so much for joining us today.